Hello, everyone. It is Lala here. So, I made an analysis for the first two eras of the challenge, and I'm going to continue the trend with this one, i.e., Era 3. From what I looked through online within the challenge fandom, this is seen as the best era, which I personally agree with. It doesn't have the structural issues of Era 1, the disgusting misogyny and overwhelming themes of Era 2, and the dragged out format slash poor casting issues of Era 4. The format of Era 3 were very simple when it came to the structure of the game. Last place automatically went into eliminations, which is something that should have been done eons ago, and something that should have been consistent with Era 4. And the theme of the season involves personal relationships. So, like the last two videos, I'm going to go over my general thoughts on each season and talk about some notable trends within each season and to see how the era evolved overall. Then I'm going to go over the casting trends of each cast in the era to see what changed, what remained the same, and etc. Then I'm going to go down to talk about the defining people of the era in one way, shape, or form. Rivals is the start of the themed seasons based on relationships, with this, of course, being Rivals, which is used two more times in the season, and I think that's the most that a relationship theme has been used in this specific era. So it was a huge hit. The pair that wins the daily and who is of the gender that is facing an elimination wins immunity. There are gendered eliminations that alternate every other episode and round, and the house votes who will face the last place pair into the elimination. The format is pretty simple in a good way, but I remember the politics being very boring in the season, since people who have been going at it over the last few seasons, so the likes of Kenny, Bananas, Evan, as well as the likes of an Evelyn, Wes, Nehemiah, and all of them, ended up forming a large alliance. What made up for the stale politics in the season was the drama that took place throughout the season, where there was always something going down, and some of the most notable fights ever took place in the season, like the whole CT and Wes. There's also the mess with Wes and Carmaria, and I'm sure there's just more that I am missing throughout the season as well. Most of the politics was just get out CT, but that didn't really lead to a whole lot happening in general. Overall, it is a good season and it is one of the best ones, though I had it as the best when I watched this for the first time, but I don't think that's the case anymore. We move on to Battle of the Exes, which I always thought was okay when I watched it before this rewatch, but this is probably the season that I dropped the most on so far out of all the seasons that I've watched and recapped. I just found the season to be very boring, and I think it had to do with a lot of the dynamics, with the exes not being really interesting. The politics in the season was also very boring, and there wasn't much drama to make up for it. CT and DM cannot carry the season, though they carry it for a lot of other people apparently, and the blackface stuff really disturbed me, and I didn't care for the Communinator at all. Despite all that, it is a watchable enough season, and I do like the format of the season, with the couple who wins the daily choosing the other opponent to go into elimination, and last place goes into elimination. The season is just extremely overrated, in my opinion, and I don't see it as the prime of the show, but they clearly learned from this season when they made the next Exit season. So, to me, it was very interesting that they decided to do another Battle of the Seasons due to the fact that the last one they did was a decade ago at this point, and both seasons came to be due to needing a newer crop of people for the show and to potentially carry the torch. Instead of having it based on a team of two competing against one another, but the people in those teams are also paired with the person of the opposite gender from the real world or world rule seasons, like the first one, this season had all real world teams, with the exception of one, and that was the Fresh Meat teams, or the Fresh Meat team. And the teams were a group of four, but two people, i.e., a guy and a girl, go home every episode, where teams can and did get completely washed out, as a guy and a girl from each team that went into elimination had to face one another. So I did enjoy the season a lot more than I did during the first time I watched it, where when I watched this for the first time, it was literally one in the bottom five, but it rose up a lot in my rankings this time. There was a lot of drama, strong enough personalities, and the show went on without the vets at the time, but there was a lot of violence that took place, and there was a lot of purple shirt people as well. Or, yeah, red t shirt people or purple edited people as well. So it's probably a lower to middle ish season, in my opinion, but that's a huge rise. So we have our first sequel themed season with Rivals 2, and I remember liking the season when I watched it for the first time, but I honestly think that it is just as good as the first Rivals, which I really wasn't expecting. Honestly, I might like this season more than I liked the first one. I will say that the politics of the season was a lot more interesting compared to its predecessor, and the undergender having the control of the fates was a really interesting choice, especially with the votes. We saw the newer crop that was kind of established during the prior season make their way here, and they have to interact with the established veterans, which caused for a very interesting dynamic. And the format was also the same as the first Rivals. I will say that some of the rivals were not nearly as strong compared to the first Rivals, but most of them did have a moment that did justify them being paired, and it didn't come off as manufactured, with the exception of one, and that is Johnny Bananas and Frank. It had the gameplay, drama, humorous moments, and good challenges, though it's really around here where you really felt some sort of shift. I don't know if it's because a lot of the era 2 people were leaving by this time, but I'll get more into that in the next section. Three Agents is consistently by the fan base seen as arguably the best season in the entire show. And while I do think that it is a very good season, I don't know if I feel like it is the best season. So I think I had it as the best when I first watched it, though that kind of changed. Anyways, I think the main thing that stands out about this season in a positive way is the formatting, where some of the dailies are in teams, some are individual, others are in partners, and anyone who didn't win can go home due to the kill card. So you have to compete in order to make it to the end more than any other season. There was some interesting drama in the season for sure, with the Jordan versus Bananas feud, Teresa causing havoc, and the whole Laurel and Cara Maria stuff. But I think one of the reasons why the season isn't or it might not be the best, in my opinion, is that I do think that it is a bit top heavy with the editing. Since a lot of people on the season didn't have much to do at all, and you barely saw them, and some of these people made it pretty far as well. Overall, it is still a fun and enjoyable season, and I think it is up there with some of the best. One thing that really shocked me, and one that really rose to my rankings, is Battle of the Exes 2. I do remember kind of liking it during my first watch, but the first 3 to 4 episodes really turned me off due to what happened with DM, and it was just very painful to watch. So I was mixed on it pretty much the first time I watched it. I also noticed that the formatting started to get more messy here, and it only got worse from this point onwards within the era and especially throughout Era 4, which we will get into at some point. I think what saved the season and caused me to like it more is the casting, where most of the pairs did not like one another and had an interesting dynamic with one another, which was really missing from the predecessor. I also found the politics to be very interesting this season, and it is one of the more political seasons of the show ever. I did not like the redemption, technically the X L twist, though I think they handled it a lot better here than they did in the other 2 seasons that had a similar twist, though they didn't really put it on the actual episode. Obviously, the ramifications of this season with the Johnny Bananas and the Sarah thing is huge, and then it kind of leads to the continuing storyline of Nani being seen as an SLUT and a whole bunch of other stuff that really stands out. One season that I did not change my opinion on, that I had a low opinion on, is Battle of the Bloodlines, which I think was essentially a waste. Yes, there are a few moments of drama that were kind of spurts than anything consistent, where the only continuing source of drama was the whole affair with Thomas and Carmaria, where when Abraham came in, we had to deal with all of that, and I didn't care to get into that or the Carmaria versus Bananas at all. The entire situation was grimy, but the other main issue that I have, outside of the casting issues, which I will get into later on in the video, is the shitty format. The first two episodes were normal pair rounds, but then the next several episodes had the bloodline split into two teams, where they went back and forth, beginning which gender having to go into elimination as they were alternated. But the issue is some bloodlines were male to male, others were female to female, others were male to female, meaning that the mixed gender bloodlines were always in danger. And it makes it even worse because even if you're on the winning team, you will still go home if your parent loses an elimination, and that's another element that I didn't like, where half of them weren't even in an elimination, but they went home. Overall, it was just a swing and miss, in my opinion, and easily one of the worst seasons of the show. Rivals 3 is the only trilogy of the era, and it does make sense that it would be Rivals that got that claim. My thing with this season is the format is still good and it's the same as the other two seasons, but the main thing that causes it to be so much weaker than not only the other two, but a lot of the other seasons around it is the casting. I'll delve more into this later, but the issue here is that the pairs that were chosen, many of them weren't rivals at all, and some of them were cast over stuff that didn't even happen on the show at all. And what made it even worse is that not only due to the lack of competitiveness in the cast, but all of the DQs and quits that happened within the first half of the season, which really threw off the pacing of the season, and it made it a drag to watch. Despite all that, the format was still decent, like I mentioned earlier, though it was mixed gender pairings, which might have been why a lot of the pairings were more manufactured this time around, and there was a solid amount of drama that happened. So while it isn't good, it isn't one of the worst, though it was obvious that Bananas and Sarah were going to steamroll. It is also the last of the relationship themed seasons that made the era what it is, and I always found it interesting that they ended it here. Maybe they realized that it was a bit too much of a struggle and they'd have to manufacture more pairings in the future, so they just kind of ended it here. Maybe. We are getting close to the end of the era, and they realized that they wanted to establish some newer stars, which is where Invasions of the Champions came in. I do think they executed it well for the most part, especially with the fact that the newbies had to fight their way into the Oasis, which is the main house, and the people who couldn't earn their spots were booted very early on. There were sides of the house that were formed and it kind of withered away once they entered the Oasis, and the champions came in after that. It was disappointing to see that the champions and the contenders couldn't really compete or face off against one another, and there was only a few rounds where the champions actually had to compete, but I still think that it's a pretty solid season. There was a lot of new and fresh drama, and I did like the final, but it kind of started the vibe that would continue into Era 4, though we got quite a few of the to be continued cliffhangers as well, which was kind of just annoying. Honestly, it's mainly the format that held the season back, since without that, it definitely could have been an all time great season, in my opinion. Our final season of the era is 3030, which was supposedly the start of a new trilogy that they didn't even realize was the case when the season was filmed/aired, only for that to be retconned once the official eras of the show were recently stated. We do have the first Redemption House, which was a twist of the Exile twist on Battle of the Exes 2, but it happens 3 times in the season, which is definitely very overkill and deterred from the season, especially with the third round. And it's actually shown on the episode, unlike the Exile twist on Exes 2. But I don't like how during the third round, the winners of the daily chose people to go there, even if they didn't get last. I also forgot to mention during the invasion section that the purge was introduced there and it continued here, and it was kind of hit or miss at point in times. Of course, there's the whole incident with the racism with Camilla that was not handled well at all, and even the Simone and Shane situation really just rubbed me a wrong way. And it was that kind of stuff that definitely held the season back for me. And I do think that my opinion on the season dropped a bit, since when I watched it the first time, I still liked it despite the problematic stuff, but it's definitely lower now, in my opinion. Now it is time to go over the cast of each season in the era to notice certain trends in that regard. I did the same thing with the prior two eras and adding the era representations in the cast in the last era, using the colors to distinguish which one was era 1 and era 2, and I'm going to do the same thing here. With the colors being shown here will represent who is from era 1, who's from era 2, and now era 3. So I started era 2 talking about how the Gauntlet 2, which was the first season of that era, was like a farewell to a lot of the people who were on the prior era, before doing a cleanse in the next season or two. Era 3 pretty much started out the exact same way with the Era 2 representatives, and it's more clear once we look at the cast of Rivals 1. So we have Anissa and Robin, and Adam and CT pretty much representing Era 1 in this cast, where Adam and Robin are on their last legs, and we start seeing CT and Anissa being the sole consistent representations of Era 1 throughout Era 3. We do have newbies, and the first people from Era 3 who will become notable, like Leroy, who's on most of the seasons of this era, and Jasmine and Janae, who are present throughout the first half of the era, and the one season wonders being Adam and Mike. With all that being said, most of the cast is filled with people who are from Era 2, with the regulars and era defining people like Johnny, Wes, Paula, Evelyn, Tyler, had to come back, Kenny, Jen, Evan, and Nehemiah, Sarah, Davis, I guess, though he's very inconsistent, and Tyree, who are all present in the season. There are also newer veterans on the cast like Teresa, Camilla, Brandon, Ty, Caitlin, Mandy, Laurel, and Carmia, who are making names for themselves, and they debuted within the last season or two. What made the cast work is that the rivalries were very real, and we could see their rivalries, whether they were on the challenge or from the real world season. So we saw the beginnings and the continuations of their rivalries on TV, which won't be the case with some of the rivals for the next two, technically three rivals seasons if we're including Final Reckoning. But just from looking at this list, there are so many people who are either has their last flagship season or season in general here, like Tyler, though he came back for All Stars, Evelyn, Kenny, Michael, Jen, Adam, Evan, Nehemiah for a while up until Battle of the Eras and All Stars, Caitlin, Davis, and Adam. So that's a bunch of names, with the exception of two who never comes back after this, and other people who are slowly on their way out, like Paula, who has two more seasons left, Mandy, and Robin, who each have a season left after this. So it's kind of like the last stand, just like or the swan song of era 2 here, like the Gauntlets 2 was the swan song of era 1. So, like I mentioned, the pairings made sense. Adam and Leroy had issues on the real season. Anissa and Robin, yeah, they did have a rivalry, though it's from the duel, which happened like 5 or 6 years ago up until this point. Davis and Tyree apparently had beef on the real world season. Camilla and Teresa had their argument on the last season. The same thing with Brandon and Ty. Caitlin and Sarah had issues from the real season and Fresh Meats too, if I remember correctly. Evan and Nehemiah didn't like one another in the duel too, but I don't know if it was a strong feud, though it got stronger with this season, so I guess it paid off. Jasmine and Jenny apparently fought over a guy on the real season. Adam and CT literally had like a 9-year feud up until this point, going all the way back to the real world season, so they make sense. Jen kind of like pushed Mandy on Fresh Meats too, so that makes sense, and called her horsey face. Carmia and Laura had huge issues last season, so they make sense. Kenny and Wes was the biggest feud within the last few seasons up until this point. Evelyn and Paula was definitely a stretch. Yes, Evelyn worked with the guys in the final during the island, but she and Paula didn't have any like beef or anything, so I thought that was kind of weird. And of course, Johnny and Tyler had their issues going all the way back to the real world season. Overall, it's a very good cast. A lot of them are on their last stand, but while it's kind of sad, I do think it's for the best. Since a lot of the toxicity that Era 2 was known for, especially in the second half, a lot of these people contributed to, and I think the show needed to move on from them in order to get the greatness of Era 3 that we got, especially with the cast. Battle of the Exes did bring in 5 rookies, all of them from the real world Las Vegas, and they all flopped, as they were all gone by the first 3 episodes of the season, and they didn't add much on a competitive or a personality point of view. Even the other Era 3 people introduced last season didn't make much of an impression or last long in the season, i.e. Jasmine and Leor. Due to this, we have a lot of old school vibes on this season, so it's still kind of left over from Era 2, in my opinion, as we still had a lot of Era 2 members such as Sarah, Wes, Vinny, and Mandy on their last season here, with this being both of their last season. Terry thankfully winding down. Cara Maria being the last minute add on for a few seasons in a row from this point onwards. Camilla, Johnny, and DM still having some gas in the tank left, with Emily, Ty, Dunbar, and Paula being on their last legs at this point as well. We also have a lot more Era 1 people with CT, Mark, Robin, who's on her final season, Anissa, Rachel, and Abram. Most of these people either being on their last season or on their second last flagship season work. Abram only had one more season after this, and Mark and Rachel had this as their last season, but then a Battle of the Eras happened. So out of this group, only CT and Anissa became the regulars. I think the issue with this season is that the dynamics were not really interesting within the couples. Camilla and Johnny had an off-camera hookup because he had a girlfriend and he was trying to hide his cheating, which ended up driving Camilla crazy, and I didn't find their dynamic interesting. Despite her, Camilla made her freak out. CT and DM are a great pairing, but they can't carry a season for me with their dynamic. Emily and Ty did at least have a dynamic compared to most of the others, but it did get odd, especially with the whole blackface situation. Mark and Robin stuff was so old at this point in time, where neither one of them had any feelings. I believe it's been like 7 or 8 years by this point for them. So Dunbar and Paula had such interesting dynamics in other seasons, but there really wasn't anything here. They seemingly got along pretty well, and I don't remember them getting a whole lot of screen time when it comes to their interactions with one another. Anissa and Rachel representing the female-female pairings is nice, but it is odd that there is a male-male pairing, though I know they tried, and it caused for the two of them to be at a disadvantage. But even the dynamic between Anissa and Rachel wasn't very strong here. Abram and Carmaria were together, so I don't know why they're on an X's season. Apparently, they wanted Coral with Abram, but they couldn't get her. But they didn't want to drop Abram, and I believe Dustin and Heather were also together as well when the season was filmed. Lewa and Naomi had some dynamic where she was very clingy towards him, and we did see Jasmine punch Tyree, so yeah. This is really the final season that had a decent enough Era 2 and Era 1 presence, and a balanced presence amongst all three eras, before the succeeding seasons had a majority of Era 3 people on it, with a sprinkle of people from the first two eras on it. I also forgot to mention that I really didn't like the repeat pairings here, which we saw with Sarah and Vinny and Mandy and Wes, as I just thought it was just very, very lazy, and they do this a few more times within the era, which is honestly just annoying to me. Battle of the Seasons 2 came in at a very pivotal point of time, where a lot of the established veterans, especially of Era 2, were slowly leaving the show, and the producers also wanted to establish some new blood as well, which is why some of the Era 2 people that wanted to do this, so like the Key West cast, which included Bananas, Paula, Janelle, and Tyler, as well as the Sydney cast, which included Kellyanne, Dunbar. I think they were trying to recruit Isaac around this point in time as well, weren't on the season. So the oldest people on the show, based on their debut on the challenge, were the Austin team, which included Danny, Melinda, and Wes, and the Fresh Meat people, where they combined both casts with Eric, who is from the first, Cara Maria and Brandon from the second, and throwing Camilla in there as well, despite her technically not being a Fresh Meat, where both teams were booted immediately. And that really made this into the Era 3 show, and it kind of ended the transition that the prior two seasons of the era were when it comes to the cast. The few people who are older that got to last were not as notable people, i.e., Chet, CJ, Derek, and JD, with the only regular from the past era in Sarah, but seeing her with a whole new group of people made her very interesting since she didn't have the typical people to bounce off of and she had to stand out on her own. Seeing OG returnees in Alton and Trishelle was very interesting and refreshing as they hadn't been on in a very long time. It had been close to a decade for Trishelle, and I think it was like 7 years for Alton. and them being paired with the other Las Vegas people from like a decade later, and Dustin and Annie cast for some interesting dynamics. San Diego was a really toxic team with Frank and Zach causing the most havoc throughout the season, but both are very notable, though Sam and Ashley don't stand out nearly as much in comparison. This was one of Jonay and Derek's bigger seasons, though Jasmine was just there for comic relief despite making it relatively far, and CJ was just there as well, which didn't change from his first season. Devin, Nani, and Marie were all huge standouts out of the newer women, and Jimmy also had her moments as well, where the other women really don't stand out at all. Who is Laura, Mackenzie, and Lacey? Though most of the other newbie guys were duds too. So like Preston, Trey, and Rob outside of his one fight. And Knight was also annoying. We had some standouts here, but we had quite a bit of duds as well. So it's very much of a mixed bag, but it was probably worth it with some long running veterans coming from this rookie crop, but not nearly as much as they were hoping for. But I feel like it was essentially the same thing with the first battle of the seasons damn near a decade prior. Looking at the Rivals 2 cast, it's clear that it was set up for a lot of people from last season to continue making names for themselves, to kind of establish them as they ease into becoming veterans and potential mainstays, but also having to hold their own against veterans that are well established at this point in time. Looking at the pairs, a decent amount of them definitely made sense. CT and Wes always had issues going back to the duel. Jemmy and Camilla had their fight last season. Janae and Annie did have a real life fallout. Jasmine and Teresa had a fight on the last Rivals. Zach and Trey did not like one another from last season. Anastasia and Jessica did have issues from the reward season. Same with Knight and Preston, Cook and Naomi. There are some other stretches that are huge, like Paula and Emily due to what Ty did on X's. Marlon and Jordan from the Real World season, Anissa and Dem, they justify this from something that happened 7 years ago for a reason to justify this pairing. I don't recall Dunbar or Tyree ever really interacting. Jenny and Frank should not have been a couple based off of a few Twitter comments that Bananas was salty he was put on last season. Leroy and Ty should have never been a thing either, since I also don't remember them having any sort of interaction that fit in this category. The others that I didn't mention had like one fight, so it is enough, but it's not really notable in general. This season is the final season of Paula, Ty, Emily, and Derek until the circumstantial 45th, both of them, Tyree and Dunbar on the flagship. So this is kind of like the last season of the phasing out of Era 2, in my opinion. And we did get Jordan as an honorable rookie, and Jessica got a few seasons, but others like Marlon and Cook were only one season wonders. I did like the dynamics of the season with CT, West, and Bananas going at it, Frank being messy, DM becoming more villainous at the time. But it also became clear that the newer crop couldn't really keep up with the veterans, which showed in people like Rob and Trey never coming back after this. Just from looking at this list, this is the last season that really had a perfectly even, give or take, balance between Era 2 and Era 3 representatives, with a lot of the Era 2 people leaving, as I mentioned, though there were a few Era 1 people like Anissa and CT and Trishelle here. So we're in the middle of Era 3, and I think a lot of the early Era 3 people have been established at this point, to the point where some of them will start to leave the flagship at around this time. So I think the cast for free agents is decent, not the best and not the worst. I don't know if a part of this is due to the editing being very top heavy, but I don't think they were executed the best either. I mentioned during the last season that it was the final time that the Era 2 and Era 3 casts would be balanced on a specific season, but that's a lie. I actually think this season is the final balanced one in that regard, with people like Laurel, Kahada, Isaac, Emily, and Chet making returns, making Era 2 more balanced, with some of the other recent Era 2 departures, along the likes of regulars in Camilla, Carmia, Bananas, and Teresa. But half of them really don't stand out much in the season here. Anissa and TT are yet again the only notable Era 1 reps, though neither have much screen time on the season either, so their presence isn't really that large. I also think that the newbie crop isn't really strong, with Naya not really being interesting or notable this season. Johnny Rowling could be seen as the best one since he made it to the final, but personality-wise, he wasn't the best. Latoya had the most personality, but she didn't last long, and Isaac, no, sorry, Isaac isn't new. Swift didn't really do much of anything. Lua and Zach were just there in the season. The same thing with Janae, Brandon, and Jasmine, which is why this is the Latitude's final flagship season. Jessica, Carmia, Jordan, Preston, Laura, and Bananas have decent or big seasons here, so good for them at least. Frank had an ill fate of the season, and this would be his final flagship season, and most of the early boots didn't have much to do either. With Dustin flaming out after his big season and rejecting rivals due to his girlfriend, and Chet having a pathetic showing, according to the producers, which is why this would be his last season as well. Just really going over this, the cast really isn't one of the best, and I'll probably have to drop Free Agents lower on my rankings due to this, so that's kind of disappointing overall. Complained about the dynamics between the pairings on the first Battle of the Exes, but they definitely kicked it up a notch with Battle of the Exes 2. One thing that is notable that most of the cast is represented by Era 3 people, and it makes sense with a lot of the Era 2 people running their course and the producers and network wanting some new blood. This is also the first season that would introduce people from Are You the One, which was a controversial choice at the time, and the people from that show who were brought into this season weren't the best choices. Simone and John were boring, and the dynamic between them was nowhere near as interesting here as it was on Are You the One. Brittany and Adam were great, as they won many eliminations, had strong personalities, and had great dynamics together. But I think their lack of individualism hurts them in the long run, hence them only being on one season, and they didn't fit in the next few themed seasons. Justin Dustin and Jessica continued their downward trend, where this was Dustin's last season, and Jessica would carry on from his floppage into her own, leading to her final season soon after this, where the momentum for both of them is essentially just gone. Thomas and Haley offered nothing, though Thomas was lucky to have gotten another season after this. It was unfortunate what happened to CT and DM, so I do think that it's very lazy to cast them both as exes again, and like I mentioned earlier on, I really do not like repeated duos. Knight and Jeremy is what we expected it to be. There was a lot of hostility towards or between Johnny and Avery, which was kind of interesting to watch, and it was pretty much the same with Zach and Jonay, though it was more disturbing to watch with the two of them. But these two pairings had real history with one another, and we saw the real fallout. Wes and Teresa ran a good game together, and whatever tension they had with one another was gone, but they had interesting dynamics with other people to make up for the kind of lack of conflict within themselves. Jenna and Jay were fine in the season, though they had other interactions with people. There was a bit of tension with Jordan and Sarah throughout bits of the season, though they came together at the end, and you and I were such different people personality-wise, but they had their moments where they got along and others where they didn't get along. There was some baggage with Johnny and Nanny this season, though I don't think it peaked as much here as it would in the future seasons, but they had an interesting run on this season as well. In general, the dynamics amongst the couples were very strong and led to a lot of interesting politics throughout the season, and some of the best politics, or the most interesting politics, within the entire franchise. I don't have much to say about the cast of Battle of the Bloodlines. The fact that they wanted to do a fresh meat 3 essentially showed how they felt about a lot of the newer people that were cast on the most recent seasons, with most of the early Era 3 and the Era 2 people no longer being on the show at this point of time, and a lot of the newer people being introduced weren't the strongest. Half of the cast are newbies who have been on the show before. They're newbies who have never been on reality TV before, and most of them aren't reality TV material whatsoever. The only somewhat notable ones for me are Rafi, who should have been brought back, Nicole, Brianna, though she faded out after the first episodes, and those are the only positive notable ones, with Shane and Vince being negative notable ones for obviously negative reasons. I did not care whatsoever about the triangle with Abram, Carmia, and Thomas, since Thomas in general is just boring who offers nothing, and the dynamic between Carmia and Abram was uncomfortable to watch. Corey and Tony are notable rookies, where both of them had their playboy ways, with Tony cheating as soon as he got there, and Corey having a romance with Anissa, which had a lot of drama within itself. Anissa had a lot of drama this season with Corey, Cara Maria, and Kelly Ann, so she was bitchier than usual. Kahara had his last flagship season here, and I think it's fair with his disappointing run here. Nani was okay this season, though she had a closer with Kahara, and she had a few moments here and there. Oh, yes, she and Nicole had conflict throughout the season, which was pretty interesting, I will say. Though Leora and Camilla had disappointing runs this season. Most of the bloodlines never came back for a reason, and they offered nothing. And the season should have been used to develop the rookies over the last few seasons, and I think this is just one of the worst casts ever, and in general, it's just a big waste. It was clear that with Rivals 3, they wanted to bring a lot more of the Are You the One people so they can develop names for themselves, but most of them did not deliver in the drama slash personality point of view, and they were also very boring personality wise as well. Brandon and Brianna were lame, and so were Christina and Nate, despite the two of them making it pretty far in the season. I'm referring to Christina and Nate here. Nelson and Amanda were alternates who made it on, and while Amanda brought a lot of fire in the season, especially with her feud with Camilla, Nelson was a huge dud here, and should be lucky that he was invited back for another season after this. Leora and Avery being paired up was stupid here, since I don't recall them really having much of a feud, and them being pulled right from the beginning was disappointing. Johnny and Jessica was a real rivalry, so them being partnered definitely made sense, though their interactions really weren't enjoyable. Simone and Thomas were paired because of an unaired fight on XS2, and Simone brought a lot of drama on the season, with Thomas being boring yet again, and with him pulling that stunt. I was, and it seems like most of the producers were more than fine with him not coming back again. Tony and Camilla got very tense, which became very disturbing since both of them are hotheads and drunks, at least at this point, and this was a result of them getting pulled from the season. Jamie and Kelly Ann were boring as hell. I don't recall them having any interesting dynamics, which is why he wasn't brought back again, and it took her a while to come back after this. Wes and Annie were also a stupid pairing since I don't recall them having much of a conflict, but they were burnt out for other reasons, and they generally got along, though they had moments with other people as well. Dario and Nicole, while they definitely had that fight last season, they also got along pretty well this season. And it's pretty much the same thing with Devin and Cheyenne, where while I don't really think Vince and Jenna got along, or they weren't arguing at least, they were fine enough here. Of course, Johnny and Sarah were the backbone of the season and was the main rivalry that was cast around, which explained the very weak cast competitively, and it led to the infamous moment of him stealing the money from her, where she would run from the show. Though we saw them working on their relationship and the trials and tribulations of that. I also think doing male and female pairings might have caused for them to struggle casting wise, since the conflicts between same gendered people are usually more intense than the ones with opposite genders. And especially since they didn't do any exits here, I think that kind of explains why a lot of the rivalries really weren't real or intense. And it was a huge disappointing compared to the other two rival seasons. I mentioned during the last few seasons that they were struggling with their newer castmates, and it seemed like they found a few that they wanted to develop, i.e., a Corey, Tony, Jenna, Amanda, and Ashley. So they're brought back to Invasion of the Champions, in addition to some of the other newbies like Nicole, Sylvia, Kayla, and Hunter, so they could get a lot of focus as players, strategists, personalities, and to really build up a new crop of people in an engineered way that they've struggled with throughout Era 3, and I do think that it worked. There were some people that were duds, like Anika, Theo, Anthony, arguably Dario, maybe even Latoya, at least from a competitive point of view, but they were weeded out pretty quickly in the season, and the rest of them would become the group of people that would carry us pretty deep into Era 4, so I think the producers got what they wanted from the season. Also, the final season of The Road aired around this point in time, so it was a dead casting pool by the time of the season, meaning that they needed a newbie crop very soon from elsewhere, which we'll get into with Era 4. With the champions, I don't really have much complaints, with Carmelia, Laurel, and Camilla making sense, and Ashley sticking out like a sore thumb. But it's clear that she was on because recent female champs like Paula, Emily, and Sarah all recently retired at this point. CT, Zach, and Bananas definitely make sense since they've done so many seasons in the era, and Darrell was a nice shock, but he didn't do a season for like 7 years prior to this, and his last season was a flop, Fresh Meats 2, all the way back. I will say that a lot of the champions were more relaxed, especially the men, but when we did see the two groups interact with one another, it was pretty fun. I think this cast put off what Battle for a New Champion will fail to do 10 seasons later, and we'll talk to that when we eventually get there. It was a shame to see a lot of the Era 3 people that they are trying to put up throughout the last few seasons kind of get left behind here, and the format of the season definitely dampened some of the potential that the cast could have had to be an all-time great cast, but it's still pretty good from what we got from it. And now we are on the final cast of the era with Dirty 30. And just from looking at it, you can tell that they're already starting to lose interest in Are You the One as a feeder show, with Derek, Brittany, and Tori being the only ones to be on it. And none of them really being the hugest characters on the season, but obviously Tori had a good rookie season and Brittany had her moments. Emma would be the final person from the real world to ever be cast on the show as well, and Emma had an interesting vibe that was unfortunately cut short, and the less I say about Derek, the better. Due to the casting issues, it really isn't shocking that they relied on a lot of the veterans to take up most of the spots for this season. We had a few Era 1 returnees in Veronica and Derek, who haven't been on in 7 to 8 years at this point, and weren't on any season of this era currently. Anissa came back after a few years/seasons off, with CT and Darrell being back, so it was nice seeing them, even if some of them really weren't that interesting this season. Cara Maria, Johnny, and Camilla representing Era 2 was the norm at this point, though Camilla showed her ass in a wretched way this season, where this would be her final flagship season. Thank God for that. Essentially, all the people that stood out on Invasion, for the most part, were brought back this season, and while some disappointed, i.e. in Amanda, Devin, Ashley, Jenna on a personality point of view, despite her lasting a while, others like Hunter, Corey, Kayla, Nelson, and Tody had very notable people on it. There were also some disappointing people like a Nicole, a Dario, Leroy, Brianna, Simone, Latoya, and Shane. So while there are a lot of good casting choices this season, as they wanted it to be very epic, I could definitely tell with the vibe of the season, there are some filler that brings it down in my opinion. But it was a very heavy Era 3 heavy cast, and that would be a thing for at least for a decent amount of their Era 4 seasons. They wanted to go with the dirtiest players ever to be cast, but then you cast people like Leroy and Jenna and a bunch of other fellow people who didn't accomplish much on their challenge career at this point either. So when it comes to that element, this was definitely a failure, but overall it was a good cast. So now I'm going to talk about the so-called faces of Era 3, whether these were people who debuted in Era 3 or they debuted on older seasons but became more prominent on Era 3. And just from looking at this, there's really only 5 people who had the top 10 most confessionals in more than 3 seasons. Obviously, Johnny Bananas. This is the era that he's really known for. This is where he became synonymous with the challenge and he became the face of the challenge, as he was one of the top confessional getters on Rivals 1, Battle of the Exes 1, Rivals 2, Free Agents, Battle of the Exes 2, Battle of the Bloodlines, Rivals 3, and Dirty 30. Obviously, this was where Kenny and Evan were off the show right at the beginning of Era 3, so really had to stand on his own, and he kind of had to figure out his shtick, and he became the OG, especially with a lot of the Era 2 people also leaving at around this time. And this is where the challenge really started being seen as the Johnny Bananas show, and this is where they felt like they needed Johnny Bananas on every single season in order for the challenge to continue, and it definitely inflated his ego. And I don't think anyone within a specific era will have this amount of high confessional amounts per season, like Bananas, as he has 8 here. The next person is CT. Obviously, with Era 1, he was only on 2 of the season since he debuted at the tail end of Era 1. And Era 2, he always had potential to be one of the main guys, but he always got in his own way. One, he didn't do all of the seasons in Era 2. I think he might have done like 5 or 6 overall. And two, he got DQ'd from 2 of those seasons right at the beginning due to his violence, so he never became one of the major faces of the show. And then he was off for a few seasons at the tail end of Era 2. So with Era 3, he clearly knew that he needed to be on his best behavior and he needed to get it together, which we saw with Rivals. He got in a lot of drama during those early Era seasons. He started competing very well and he started consistently making it to the end and doing a lot more seasons. So we saw him get a lot of focus on Rivals 1, Exodus 1, Rivals 2. Free Agents was acquired a season from him, storyline wise, but he still got a decent amount of confessionals. Invasion of the Champions was where he won, and that was after he became a dad. He started becoming known as Dadbot CT at around this time, and Dirty 30, where he performed pretty well, though he didn't really have a lot of storyline here, which will kind of continue on to Era 4. As we all know, Cara Maria definitely came into her own during Era 3. Obviously, she debuted during the final 2 seasons of Era 2, and she was out first on one of them. But she has 5 seasons to her name where she was one of the main confessional givers on Rivals 1, Rivals 2, Free Agents, Battle of the Bloodlines, and Dirty 30. And all of this makes sense. Of course, with Rivals 1, she had to deal with not being liked and her up and down relationship with Laurel. Rivals 2 had her with Cook, where she came in as a replacement. A lot of the house still didn't really like her, and she wasn't performing up to par, but she made it to the final there. Free Agent is definitely seen by a lot of people as the Cara Maria season, since obviously she had her interesting feud with Laurel. She was sent into several eliminations on the season that she had to win, and then there's her entry where she fought through it, but ultimately she ended up going home. Battle of the Bloodlines was where she won her first season, so obviously that was going to be hugely important. Then she had her affair with Thomas, and then them bringing Abram in right after that happened caused a lot more of the focus to be on her, and she's playing a pretty solid, pretty good game. And she also had her conflict with Johnny Bananas at the time. And then Dirty 30, she was aligned with Camilla, but once Camilla stopped getting confessionals, they gave a lot of those to Cara Maria, and of course she made it to the very end, and she had that feud with Kayla and Jenna. So that kind of makes sense. So I really only have 2 people who got more than 3 seasons of being a top confessional giver that debuted on Era 3, and one of them is Nani, where she came in during Battle of the Sexes 2, and I'm honestly shocked she was one of the top 10 confessional givers on that season. She didn't make it to the final. I think we did a few rounds before the final there, but she definitely had a lot of drama. Nani was close to winning Free Agents. She had her relationship with Kohara, which got a lot of focus, and she had her drama with quite a few people there, which kind of just continued on to Battle of the Exes 2 as well. And then she and Bananas had that run where they were booted, and then they came back, and then they caused a lot of drama at the end game. Battle of the Bloodlines also had her conflict with Battle of the Bloodlines. Yeah, Battle of the Bloodlines. I'm actually kind of shocked with Battle of the Bloodlines. I believe she was booted midway through the season, but she's still up there in confessionals for that season. Really just says a lot. I know she definitely had her drama throughout the season with the likes of Daria and Rafi, but I'm really shocked she's up here. And the Rivals 3 really wasn't shocking at all, since she and Russ were kind of on the outs throughout the entire season. She had her drama with Nicole at several times throughout the season, and then she had her drama with Bananas as well, so that's really not shocking to me, in my opinion. And then the last person to have more than 3 seasons where they're in the top 10 confessional givers is Jordan, where obviously he debuted on Rivals 2. He had a lot of moments on the season. He was seen as one of the underdog newbies of the season. He got into feuds with people like Frank and Teresa, which definitely gave him a lot of moments. Free Agents, he definitely got a lot of screen time due to his feud with Johnny Bananas, which got so much focus throughout the season. And the fact that he was able to get into the top 10 confessional givers of that season, despite him being booted a bit around the halfway point of the season, really just says how much they were shoving him in our faces at that time. Battle of the Exes to really isn't shocking since he won the season. He definitely got into some of his drama with people like Wes and Anaya, and heck, even Sarah at a few points in time. And then Dirty 30, where he ended up winning the season. He had his moment with Jamie, and yeah, it's really just not shocking. And they clearly like his confessional, so not shocked with any of this, really. I don't know if I would consider the people here to be faces of Era 3, or they are their own separate category where they weren't seen as one of the faces of the era, but they weren't supporting. They're kind of somewhere in between. And these are the people who were in the top 10 most confessionals lists of a season. And these people that I have here were in the top 10 of the season for 3 seasons. So not enough where they really defined Era 3, but definitely more than most of the other people. West was kind of shocking, in my opinion, that he only was able to get 3 top 10 confessional getting seasons of the era. But when I'm really looking at it, it does kind of make sense, since I do believe on Battle of the Seasons 2 and Battle of the Exes 1, he was booted very early on both of those seasons, like first or second. So obviously he wasn't getting it for that. Rivals 1 and Rivals 2 really wasn't shocking, since he was leading the main alliance for the first Rivals. He had his drama with CT and Kenny that took up a lot of screen time. Rivals 2, he was partnered with CT throughout the season. They won that season, and then he had his feud with Bananas, which was obviously going to get a lot of screen time. And then on Battle of the Exes 2, he got a lot of screen time because he was masterminding a lot of the moves that were taking place during the game. He had his feud with Bananas that was very important to the season. He got into it with Jordan later on as well, and then he got screwed over by XL. Rivals 3 was shocking that he wasn't listed as one of the top 10 confessional givers of that season, since he did make it pretty far on the season. I think he was booted the second to last round before the final there, where I had Nanny on the last list for that season, but I think West was kind of just over it and he needed to detox and have a break, so I think that's why he wasn't in the top 10 confessional givers for that season. So Paula, a part of me was shocked that she was here and a part of me isn't. A part of me was shocked because she only did 3 seasons in the era, and these were her final 3 seasons, and they aren't her most memorable compared to what she did earlier on in her career, which were in the last era. But I'm also not shocked as well, because whenever Paula's on a season, especially after her first few seasons, she in general always tends to get a lot of confessionals. So with that being the case with her final 3 seasons, it really shouldn't have shocked me. But she ended on a higher note where she really didn't have any drama in any of the seasons like that. Laurel only did 3 seasons in the era, with Rivals 1, Free Agents, and Invasions of the Champion. Obviously, she made it to the final on Rivals 1. She had her interesting relationship with Cara Maria, and then her snapping at people like Wes and Paula at the end. Free Agent, she was completely dominant. She was thrown into a few eliminations. She had her drama with Cara Maria, and I think she pissed off a lot of the women within that season, and then she won the season as well, so obviously she's going to get a lot of screen time. And then Invasions of the Champion had her coming out as a bisexual and her getting into her first woman relationship with Nicole. Her issues with Maria slowly starting to pop up again here. And all that caused her to get a lot of screen time. I think if Laura did more seasons at this time, I know she was working on being a veterinarian or going to veterinarian school, she would have been in that first group that I mentioned earlier with being official faces of the era, despite her debuting on Era 2. And then the final person I have here is Sarah, who's here for her performances on Battle of the Seasons 2, Battle of the Exes 2, and Rivals 3. She would have been in that first group if she wasn't DQ'd due to her partner's bullcrap on Battle of the Exes 1 and Rivals 2, with Trishelle quitting and Vinny being DQ'd. she probably would have made it further on those seasons and she would have had a lot more confessionals. But we saw her essentially interacting with a whole group of people that she never really interacted with on the challenge on Battle of the Seasons 2, and she still made it to the final. She had her somewhat romance with Alton, but that didn't get too much screen time. I think her just bouncing back and forth between her team and her being one of the funnier ones in the better confessionals caused her to get a lot of confessionals on that season. And of course, her final two seasons had her winning. So obviously she's going to get a lot of screen time. She's going to talk about how on XS2 how she finally wanted to get a win, so she's playing a lot more seriously and a lot more cutthroat, which did get her the win, which caused her relationship with Bananas to suffer, where she spent the entirety of Rivals 3 building that relationship up so they can not only just work together but regain that friendship, only for him to of course stab her in the heart and rip her heart out and throw it in a sewer, essentially. And that's how she ended her career. So looking at this list, there's only 3 people who debuted in Era 3 who was able to be a top 10 confessional giver on 3 seasons. One of them is Zach, which really isn't shocking because he was one of the main people on Battle of the Seasons 2, where he got into so much drama, not only just with his entire team, but with other people. He performed very well. He was in a few eliminations as well that he had to win, and he's really one of the defining people of the season. Free Agent was kind of shocking to me because I don't recall him having any notable storyline on that season, but Zach is good in confessionals. He knows how to be very witty and how to execute them very well. So despite him not having a storyline, I guess him having a lot of confessionals and free agents makes sense with him being at the end and him being one of the better confessionalists. And then Battle of the XS2, a part of me shocked with this, but a part of me isn't. I knew he made it far on the season, but he didn't make it to the last round before the final, or the final either. But his interactions with Journey definitely got a lot of focus on the season, and the start of what would become his marriage to Jenna and the mother of his kids definitely got a lot of screen time as well. So him being there, I guess, really isn't shocking. Speaking of Jenna, she is one of the other people who debuted on Era 3 who made it on this list, but she didn't get it for her first season Battle of the XS2. She's mainly here due to her being a top 10 confessionalist on Battle of the Bloodlines, Rivals 3, and Dirty 30. Obviously, Battle of the Bloodlines, she had her interactions with her cousin, and she was thrown into a few eliminations on that season where she really wanted to prove herself since she kind of chickened out of the final last season, and she didn't go into elimination whatsoever. Rivals 3, she did have her messy relationship with Zach, even though he wasn't on the season. I think it's just because she was starting to become popular in and out of the house at this point in time, so they threw a bunch of confessionals at her, though she didn't really have much storylines there. Dirty 30, I feel like it's somewhat the same here, though she didn't make it for Invasion, though she got paired on both of those seasons. I think her friendship with Kayla got a lot more focus on Dirty 30, so I think that's why she got more confessionals, and she and Kayla were against Carmaria and kind of during the second half of the season, so I think that's why. And the final person is Corey, and it's clear that they're definitely trying to build up Corey to the best of their ability at this point in time, where obviously he had a strong rookie season with Battle of the Bloodlines, with making it to the end with his cousin, and with them both being a rookie team. He had a showmance with Anissa, which was such an up and down relationship on that season. Rivals 3, he had some. Oh, yes, Rivals 3, he had his flirtments with Cheyenne, which turned into them becoming co parents with one another. And then he had a pretty big downfall there. And Invasions was definitely a huge season for him, where he made it to his second final. The start of the Young Bucks was slowly starting to form here. He had his hiccups with Camilla and Kayla on the season, and then he had his fair share of drama as well. So, yeah, and they're definitely trying to build him up to be the next big face of the challenge, and we'll talk more about that once we get into Era 4 to see if they actualized it or not. I don't have a whole lot to say about this next group of people, since they're really just other notable people who played in Era 3. They could have been people who are from the other two eras, or they could have been people who debuted in Era 3 but were a bit more memorable, though they weren't anywhere near a main character or a main supporting character. DM definitely had her two memorable seasons in Battle of the Exes 1 and Rivals 2, and that would have continued on had she not passed away. Camille was shocking. I was expecting her to be one of the huge faces of the era, since she did almost every season of the era, but she was only a top 10 confessional giver for two of them, which was Battle of the Exes 1 and Invasion of the Champions. But now that I'm thinking about it, it does kind of make sense, since there were seasons where she went home pretty early on, like Free Agents and Battle of the Bloodlines. She wasn't on some of the others. I don't think she was on Exes 2. She also went home pretty early on Rivals 1 as well, so that definitely explained why she didn't make it as high. And then Dirty 30 would have been a huge season for her, narratively wise, but obviously she showed her ass and she was edited out of the season and show mid season, so that affected her not becoming a top 10 confessional giver for Dirty 30. Anissa did a lot of seasons on the season. She made it far on a majority of the seasons she did in the era, but she is never a main player of the seasons in the era. And she was only a top 10 confessional giver for Battle of the Exes 1, which honestly kind of shocked me, and Battle of the Bloodlines, which didn't shock me. Leroy is someone who debuted in the beginning of Era 3, and he remained throughout Era 3 as he did a lot of the seasons, but he went home early on some of them, like Battle of the Bloodlines, Rivals 3, Battle of the Exes 1, and there are other seasons that while he did make it far on, he just wasn't that relevant in them, and he was kind of just portrayed, and he portrayed himself as a Bananas lackey, so he never got a whole lot of focus. The main season in the era that he did get a lot of focus on was Battle of the Exes 2, and that's the only season where he was a top 10 confessional giver on, so it makes sense. Jonay and Jasmine were consistent presences throughout the first half of the era before they took long hiatuses or retirement on Jasmine's part from the flagship show. Teresa was also a consistent presence throughout the first half of Era 3, though she only became a top 10 confessional giver for Battle of the Exes 2, which made sense during that season due to her messy politics. Jonay only became a top 10 confessional giver for Battle of the Seasons 2, which made sense due to her romance with Zach and all the mess that the Cancun team was up to. The likes of Tony and Dario were introduced during the second half of the era, and they were on the last 4 seasons of the era, where Dario was the top 10 confessional giver for Rivals 3. He was on all 4 of those seasons, and Tony was that for Dirty 30, where that was the first season where he made it far on. Other notable people who did 2 or 3 seasons were Frank and Devin, where I almost didn't include them here, but they're very, very memorable, and they're still talked about today, despite them having limited seasons in the era. And the only other person that I am going to mention is Jeremy, who did a decent amount of seasons within the era, and then she continued on the next era. So that's really all I have for this category. Not a whole lot of people to say, but I am going to talk about the issues with it soon. I also forgot to mention Nicole Ramos, who debuted on season 27. She became a top 10 confessional giver on Rivals 3, and she's the only Bloodline who did several seasons, so I think that makes her stand out even more, where all the other Bloodlines only did 1 season or 2 seasons, and none of them had the longevity or the pseudo longevity that she had. I guess I could mention Johnny Riley, since he was one of the more memorable people, especially one of the more memorable men who came in during mid-era 3, became a finalist and a runner-up on his first season, had a notable enough second season before fading out, so I guess he's notable enough to kind of mention. Okay, so just from looking at these casts and looking at some of the data that I've discussed over the last several videos, they clearly had trouble when it came to establishing some new stars with the Era 3 crop of people. And I think there's a few reasons why for this. Obviously, CT came into his own here. Bananas just took over whatever momentum he had from JEK to carry it here, and West was a more consistent presence here than he was in Era 2. So I think they just really started focusing on the trio of CT, West, and Bananas, which would carry over into Era 4. And I think they focused so much on 3 to the point where they didn't let anyone from Era 3 really have a chance to establish themselves. Obviously, they ended up trying that with Battle of the Seasons 2, where they had lower ratings than usual, and then they completely freaked out. So they felt like they needed to put those people that I mentioned on every single season. And a lot of the people who were on early Era 3 kind of left within a few seasons. We saw that with the likes of Frank, Dustin, some of the other people who debuted on Battle of the Sexes 2. Battle of the Seasons 2 didn't really carry over in the way they wanted to. And I feel like they clearly knew that the era, in the mid era 3 people that they cast around the likes of a Free Agent and a Battle of the Exes 2 really just didn't have what it takes whatsoever. And the people who did last from the earlier or to the mid portions of the season, so like a Leroy, a Zach, a Janae, a Jasmine, and a Nani, they might have like a season or two where they're like the main characters, but a lot of them were kind of just supporting as well. So I think that caused for a lot of issue. And there's a higher turnover rate here as well. But I do feel like once they got to late Era 3, they really started to figure out the people that they wanted to focus on. We had the likes of a Corey, a Tony, and Ashley, Amanda, I guess some Jenna, Nelson, a Hunter, and those types of people started becoming more and more prominent. They became a lot more consistent as that era ended and as they would continue on to Era 4. So I felt like they finally found a group of people that they wanted to center the show around at the end of the era. But it caused for like the first 2/3 of the era to really be in this awkward position where they're struggling to establish new people and they come and go very quickly. And also with the real world ending, which they foresaw around in the middle portion of the era, and it became official with the end of the era. They were trying to struggle to see where they could get people from, which is why Are You the One became a casting pool during the second half of the era, but that ended pretty quickly after this. So I do think that there were notable casting issues with Era 3, and they would come up with some solutions with that for Era 4, but I don't know if it was the proper solution, which I will get into more there. So, in conclusion, those are my thoughts on Era 3. That is my breakdown and retrospective on it. To be honest, I'm kind of shocked that this video is a lot shorter than the prior two eras that I covered, but I think it's because this era is the most consistent, not only just with the quality of the seasons being higher tier compared to the other two, but the formats, for the most part, pretty much remain the same no matter what season it is, so everything was just running very smoothly. Where there are a lot more bumps in the road regarding to Era 1, especially because they didn't really know what they were doing yet, and Era 2 had some questionable choices, and definitely didn't age as well due to the content within that era. Clearly, I'm already working on Era 4 as I did Vendettas and Final Reckoning already, and as I am making this video, I am also working on War of the Worlds, so I already see some of the trickle effect from Era 3 into Era 4, but also, I also see some of their quote-unquote solutions to some of the issues or some of the upcoming vacancies that were starting to become more prominent in Era 3, and I'm definitely going to get more into that as Era 4 goes on. But yeah, anyways, that's kind of it. Thank you all for watching, and I'll be back with more soon. Take care.